Good afternoon. In honor of Mother's Day this past Sunday, our devotions this week will look at mothers in the Bible. And today, I'm going to talk about women who were desperate to become mothers, and they despaired that they would ever have children at all. Now, this is a source of heartache for many people today. Fertility clinics are big business and they cost a lot of money. But even with their help, there are some couples who are unable to have children. I can only imagine how difficult Mother's Day and Father's Day is for couples like these. Perhaps it's a little bit like Valentine's Day for single people. But as difficult as it is in our time for people who are unable to have children, it was 10 times worse in the cultures that the Bible came from. Having a child was literally the most important thing a woman or a wife could do. It was more important than tending the home or domestic responsibilities or anything else. It was important because it was incredibly important for the family line to continue to the next generation, to pass along the family name. The closest we can think of this today is if we think about royal families, like the House of Windsor in the United Kingdom. When Prince Charles married Diana, and when Prince William married Kate, the whole world watched and waited. Would they be able to have children? And especially, would they be able to have boys? The pressure that Diana and Kate felt is the same pressure and the same amount of importance that all women felt in Bible times. Now, we know today that infertility is an issue for both men and for women. But in ancient times, the ability to bear children was seen strictly as the woman's task. Or more importantly, the failure to have children was the woman's fault. In fact, women could be divorced because of their inability to conceive, even if it was actually the husband's fault and not hers. Knowing this helps us understand why some women in the Bible went to great lengths to try to become mothers. They did their utter best to have children in any way possible. Let me name a few examples. First, there is Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the great patriarch of the nation of Israel. Now, God had promised Abraham and Sarah that he would become the father of a great nation. But God gave this promise to him after Abraham and Sarah were already at an advanced age, and guess what? They had no children. It was already nearly impossible for them to have a baby, and yet God gave them a promise that an entire nation would come from them. Well, after 10 years, despite God renewing his promise, Sarah finally took matters into her own hands. She was that desperate to want to have a child. She arranged for her husband Abraham to sleep with her servant Hagar. According to the customs of that time, the child that Hagar would have would legally be considered to be Sarah's child. And indeed, Hagar did have a child named Ishmael. But when Ishmael was born, God made it clear that he was not the fulfillment of the promise, that Sarah herself would have a child. To make a long story short, Hagar giving birth to Ishmael caused a lot of problems for Hagar, for Ishmael, and for the entire family. And it was only 15 years later that Sarah ultimately was able to have a child of her own. For the next example, we fast forward 2 generations to meet Abraham and Sarah's grandson, Jacob. Now, Jacob married 2 sisters, and it's a whole story why he married both of them. Their names were Leah and Rachel. Rachel was Jacob's favorite. But there was a competition between these 2 sisters for who could have the most children, because even though Jacob favored Rachel, if Leah was the one to have the children, then she would be top dog. And indeed, Leah ended up having 4 sons. But Rachel didn't have any. She was desperate, and so she tried the same strategy that Sarah did and gave Jacob her servant girl. And indeed, Rachel's servant girl then had 2 sons. But Leah, watching this, was not to be outdone, and she did the same thing and gave Jacob her servant girl, who also had 2 more sons. Then Leah had 2 more of her own. So if you're keeping score, it's Leah 6, Rachel 0, not counting the 2 servant girls. But then finally, by God's grace, Rachel was finally able to have a son, and then later another. Now, to put it mildly, this rivalry put a strain on the entire family, and it continued to the next generation because Rachel's 2 sons were Jacob's favorite, and that ended up causing great sibling rivalry, to put it mildly. My last example comes from the New Testament. Here we meet Elizabeth, who is the wife of the priest Zechariah, and the 2 of them were faithful and pious people, but they had no children. Their inability to have children was seen as a curse from God, despite the fact that they were devout people. Now, like Abraham and Sarah, they received a promise that they would have a child. But Zechariah didn't believe it. And so he was struck speechless until their baby boy was born. His name was John. He grew up to become John the Baptist, who heralded the way for Christ himself. So what can we learn from these women? We can learn that at times, God promises a blessing to us that is far beyond what we can imagine. The goal for us is to trust that God's promise is true, even if it is hard to believe. And we must wait for God's time to fulfill his promise. If we get impatient and try to force things, all we'll do is cause problems. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, I lift up to you women like Sarah and Rachel and Elizabeth, women today who have a deep desire to have children, but for one reason or another are unable to. And I pray, Lord, that your grace and favor would rest upon them. And I pray for each of us, Lord, as we seek for you to fulfill your promise to us, that we, first of all, would believe your promise and not doubt like Zechariah. But secondly, that we would trust in you and in your timing for your promises to unfold, rather than trying to shake the tree and make things happen, as Sarah and Rachel did. And may all of this be to the glory of your name. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.